All right. Okay, so it's 2 o'clock, so I think I'll get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you again for joining, as always. We're going to be focusing on lesson 6 of our Waste to Edible Greens webinar series. I'm Deidre. I am your webinar instructor, and I'm also the workshop designer at Live in Farms. Okay, and just a reminder for everyone, in case you're new to the Demio platform, you can move the slider up and down the screen. If you do want to focus more on the presentation or on my face, you choose, okay? All right, so lesson 6, this is going to be our Design Future Food Restaurant Concepts, part 1. Okay, and basically for this lesson, we're going to be taking a more hands-on approach with the students. This is really a brainstorming lesson that we have with the students, and we want to address the fact that a lot of sustainability issues tend to be really, really daunting for a lot of people, and especially students, right? These can be challenges that don't just focus on one community, but they can expand across the entire world because of the way that certain systems are shaped, such as our food system, which is very international. Okay, and identifying these problems is only one step to this, to these issues. Like that, we do need to take further steps to actually start to talk about solutions and how people arrive at these solutions. And that's basically what this lesson is about, the first part of these 2 lessons. And there's going to be 2 activities that I'll talk to you guys about. The first will be a brainstorming activity that we do with the students. We take a look at a particular example that addresses Surabaya in Indonesia. And the next is going to be an activity, and we're going to be talking a little more about tips and tricks that you, as like an educator, or even just if you want to apply this lesson because it is quite generic to your own life in order to solve your own sustainability problems, or just find a starting point, that will hopefully help you there. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to want to do is actually take a quick recap in the first lesson and the second webinar. We did talk about food systems in general. Like I said, they can be quite, or the way that things are set up right now, they're quite large. They span across multiple countries. And because of the way that these food systems are structured, there's a lot of problems with these food systems. And just to recap, one of those major problems is its inefficient use of resources, right? These food systems are so long and drawn out, and waste is being produced at every single step of the way, right? And it's just inefficient. The second is this exponential demand for animal protein, which is, regardless of whether you individually are a vegetarian, the trend is that we are moving towards a time when people are going to expect more animal protein in their diet than they ever had before. And it's going to be somewhat accessible to most people. Okay, the third is food waste disposal and just waste generation. In general, food waste, like we said, is an organic type of waste that can actually be broken down and used within the home and processed within the home. But at the moment, the way that it is in most cities, it usually just ends up in the landfill with all the other waste. And you can look at some of the older videos. I believe that is going to be webinar number 4 that will talk specifically about some of the problems associated with doing the strategy of just throwing everything there at once. Okay, and finally, there's the pollution that's generated. And this does include the waste. A lot of these points I just named kind of bleed into each other. But in general, pollution is generated at every single step of the food system. These include things, not just the food waste generated, but there's a lot of pollution that goes into our water, our air, the animal rights abuses, the amount of antibiotics that we pump into the animals that we raise for livestock. That antibiotics, 80% of the antibiotics that we create as a human population is actually spent on keeping our food healthy, because there's such an unhealthy relationship that we have. So there's like a lot of intrinsic problems, and this can be super super intimidating for people, right? I think it's quite common for people to talk about the problem. So let's start to look at what a solution may or may not look like. Okay, and so I'm just going to talk a little bit about this idea of green cities, of sustainability, right? These are terms that get thrown around a lot in Asia in particular, just because that's where I'm talking from. We tend to think of cities like the one in this photo, which is Singapore, for example. They have an entire green section of the city, right? We've got places like Tokyo, we've got Seoul, we've got Taipei City, and those are generally examples of what people like to think of as more sustainable communities and more sustainable cities. And definitely they have made great leaps in terms of addressing the kind of sustainability problems that occur when there's so many people are living in one place. Okay, but this is a very particular example of what a sustainable city might look like. And what I wanted to introduce today is an example of a city that really worked with the community and actually helped pave the way for these other sustainable communities and inspired them to take a greater look at how they were dealing with the problems. And you can't just address these issues from top down. Like, you can't just have laws that say, okay, you guys are going to stop polluting, you're going to process your waste a certain way, and you tell people what to do based on the government's kind of mandate, right? It's actually very complicated and people do not respond well. Like, we've seen that in a lot of different examples around the world. It just doesn't work to the same effectiveness. Okay, and so in this next part, I just hope you guys, there's not many of us attending today, so I'm just going to share this poll really quickly. It would be awesome if you guys can just really quickly answer. This is basically where we say to the students, okay, even if you're in the classroom with us in this one particular city, like, where are you guys coming from? What are your experiences? Because there's a different relationship with sustainability, with the environment, that is very much dependent on the history and the communities in which you're brought up in. Okay, the example that we have today I've put down, you can see in the corner, is Surabaya, and that is from where I'm from in Indonesia. You can see we're like a big island nation. I see that we have people joining us from Asia, from America, from Europe, and that's really awesome. That I would encourage people to type in as well into the chat any sustainable communities that they're familiar with, how you personally are taking sustainability action. That would be awesome. The Americas, I had to group them in just because we don't have a lot of, I can't put too many options. So sorry if you are coming from not the US, because that's generally where people say that they're from, if they're from the Americas, but that's not true, obviously. But I would love to hear about, what your experiences are. So please share those, and the moderators can point those out, and we can have a little more of a discussion later. Okay, and there's definitely this idea that sustainability has to do with like metal straws. We have no plastic bags, and that's a particular type of sustainability approach. And let's take a look at this example right here. So this slide I'm showing you is Surabaya. So just to give a quick introduction, Surabaya is located on Indonesia's most populous island of Java. It's the second densest city in our country. Jakarta has about 7.5 million people. By the way, that's more than the entire population of Australia in this one city. And Surabaya, by comparison, has 2.5, almost 3 million people living there, which is still a whole lot of people. It's still considered one of the mega cities. Okay, and in the early 2000s, there was a problem that had been developing for a while, but in general, it was just starting to get to the point where waste was piling up on the streets. There were a lot of rats, some sanitation issues, health issues that were occurring because people were interacting with all of this waste on a day-to-day basis. Even just walking on the streets, it was becoming a hazard for the population that lived there. And in as little as 4 years, after the new mayor came in, they were able to change the way that they dealt with their waste. And you can see the change there. This photo is actually just after that 4-year period. It might have been even like 5 years, so 2005, right? That was, you can see that there's a huge change. It's a lot less dirty, there's more greenery. And this is because of a strategy that, yes, it was implemented by the government, but it really involved a lot of dialogue between the people, between outside organizations and countries to figure out a way to deal with the waste that was suitable for Surabaya city in particular. Okay, and this strategy, after they looked at the waste, they realized that in Surabaya, the waste that was being generated was more than half of it was organic waste. That's higher than a lot of other places, but the fact that so much of it was organic waste led to a lot of problems when the waste ended up on the streets. But it also created a lot of opportunity if they were to teach people how to properly handle the waste. Okay, the strategies included things like the distribution of composting bins. These were very simple bins, just usually plastic bins. They used the Takakura method of composting, which you can look at. This is all public information, by the way. And they had a lot of educational programs that the government enacted, but also they partnered with a lot of local organizations, especially the local women's organization. The local women's organization had a huge role in teaching the local people not just about the problems of throwing away your organic waste on the streets, but also teaching them how they could process the food waste within their own homes. And I want to keep in mind that in Surabaya in particular, and in much of Indonesia, we do have very large populations of people who live quite low, below the poverty line. So that was another thing they had to take into account. Okay, the third thing that they did was they started to create these composting facilities. The composting facilities, some of the larger ones, which were built outside of the city, would take in waste not just from Surabaya city, but also the neighboring areas, a lot of agricultural areas, which would, of course, create more organic waste than plastic waste that they would have. And they would also create these smaller community centers where people in different neighborhoods could come together and sort through their waste together. And this helped create a cohesion between different members of the community that didn't necessarily have that way to interact and connect in the first place. And lastly, there was a big push to incentivize recycling and technological innovations on ways to deal with this waste. I mentioned briefly in one of the other lessons that one of the major issues with putting organic and inorganic waste together is that it makes recycling very difficult because organic waste will contaminate the inorganic waste. So if you did want to start a recycling program that had to do with recycling plastics and glass and cardboard, for example, you can't do that if organic waste is being thrown in and soiling the cardboard, for example. You can't actually recycle that cardboard anymore. You can't recycle like those paper cups with wax on them, like people use for food. Those also are soiled and contaminated, and those can't go through processing either. And that's by teaching the public to separate it, then they were starting to be able to process different types of waste they weren't able to process before as a city. Okay, and the outcomes of these initiatives resulted, like I said, was 20% of waste reduction in the first 4 years. Other cities such as Tokyo were able to learn and follow from the example set out in Surabaya and apply that to these larger cities that we know about today as having such progressive waste management systems. And the Surabaya people were able to create such large benefits to their community through quite small steps, actually. And so that's really the takeaway that we try to have for the students in this lesson in particular is that these big changes really start with the small steps. And so we want them to start to think about, given all these big problems going on in the world, these big, very daunting issues, how can we pull back a little bit and decide, okay, where can I start? Where can I start small and build upon that? And so that we can start to push overall together for larger changes in our society. All right, so really quickly, I'm going to show you guys a video. This is a video that I actually shared in the third webinar, but at the time we were using a different platform, so I thought it would be important to share it again. It's a very quick video, but I will fast forward just a tiny bit. And this video is actually from the Surabaya projects, or the community-based projects that went on there. So let's just take a look.
Let's start with the BSF rearing unit, the heart of the facility. This is where we produce millions of small larvae every day. Life usually starts with sex. In our case, mating takes place in a so-called love cage. We provide the flies with a water source for drinking, space for mating, and a place where the females lay their eggs, the so-called eggies. After a week of hard reproduction work, most of the flies have died and we remove the love cage. We bring the harvested eggies to the nursery, where they are placed over a tray with feed. When the young larvae hatch, they fall into the feed, where they immediately start to eat. Due to the constant rain of hatchlings, we call this the hatchling shower. After 5 days of feeding, the young larvae, the so-called limadol, are ready for the waste treatment. We need about 600 to 800,000 larvae for 1 ton of waste. We thus have to separate the larvae from the feed and count them. Of course, we only count a few grams and extrapolate the total number. The portioned young larvae are then ready to be used in the waste treatment units. A small fraction, let's say about 1% of our young larvae, will be needed to keep the colony running. They are fed a mixture of chicken feed and water for about 2.5 weeks, until they transform into prepupae and are ready to pupate. They do this in boxes with a moist pupation material where they will bury themselves and go through metamorphosis. The time it takes from pupa to adult varies from 10 to 20 days. We place the pupation boxes in so-called dark cages. Now, whenever a fly emerges, it will remain calm and wait, because activity in general and mating of the black soldier fly in particular is stimulated by light. When we want to set up a new love cage, we connect the 2 cages and lure the flies into the love cage with a lamp. The cycle is completed and the whole game may begin again. Now that we have seen how to produce young larvae in great and defined numbers, we move on to the actual bio-waste treatment unit. In the case of our facility in Indonesia, we receive waste from a fruit and vegetable market. To make the waste easily accessible for the BSF larvae, we shred it with a hammer mill, but any kind of shredder can do that. Our fruit and vegetable waste mixture is very wet. We therefore let it drain for a day or 2 to reduce the water content. Here you can see the treatment setup. We work in crates because one person can handle them and we can stack them onto a pallet. Between every layer of trays there is a metal frame which allows air circulation. The larvae stay in the trays for 2 weeks. During this period they are fed 3 times. That means that every pallet treats about 500 kg of waste. Once the larvae have reached a good size, the whole pallet can be harvested. Because we have very wet substrate, we put the residue and the larvae on a screen where the liquid flows and the larvae crawl through. The larvae can then be strained from the liquid. The larvae are rinsed with water before being further processed. But what to do with the larvae now? This really depends on the local situation. If your customer is nearby, you might be able to directly feed the larvae to fish or chicken. If you want a product that is easier to store and transport, you have to think of methods to kill and dry the larvae. We are currently testing a pelletizing machine to produce easily marketable fish or chicken feed.
All right. Okay, so I hope you guys enjoyed that video. It was a very quick look inside their black soldier fly facility. A little bit about this facility is that they partnered with a Swiss organization called EOWAG, and they built this facility as part of that innovation push. And that facility in particular takes in organic waste from Surabaya and the surrounding communities, and they process it, like they said, into chicken feed and fish feed, which can help further create food for further down the line. Okay, and next what we do with the students actually is this walkthrough brainstorming activity. And I'll just say that this is a very general activity. This is not something that the Surabaya example, they didn't do this, but this is from us in particular, and this isn't the only brainstorming way, but we did want to equip students with tools on how they can start to broach these big problems. Okay, and let's see, so the activity starts with, it will go through 3 different brainstorming rounds. Each round will only last 2 to 3 to 5 minutes, depending on the round. And the first round that we do is the community round. Okay, so that's round 1. I have an example right here. I hope it doesn't turn up backward when I show you guys, but let's see. So very simply, students will be grouped into about 3 to 4 people. They will have a sheet of paper, which they'll fold in half, and they'll just write, they'll just start off by writing community right in the middle. Is that? Okay, I hope you can see that. So that's just very simple. We start with that, and we challenge the students to look at, to just have an idea dump of what communities they want to focus on when they are tackling their own sustainability problems. I'll talk more about what that'll look like on a more local sense, but we can go through Surabaya really quickly, right? Okay, so Surabaya, I've just written really quickly some examples of what students might put. We have run this lesson before with students, and we had some very positive feedback. The students come up with really great answers, honestly, things that we don't even think about. But if we're talking about Surabaya, we have things like the entire Surabaya city, which would count as a community. You can think of the surrounding rural areas as a separate community. You can break that down into different neighborhoods. You can break it down into different socioeconomic classes, because different communities are affected by pollution and by the effects of pollution in different ways. For example, in almost all cases, the poor, the indigenous communities, the people who are marginalized in society are often impacted the most by waste and pollution. Okay, in Surabaya in particular, we have people like vendors, street vendors, we've got street cleaners, we've got people who do what we call gojek, where they're literally shuttling goods and people around the city on motorbikes. And of course, we have the homeless populations. And we really try to challenge the students to not just think about community as one thing, to try to break community down, to build it up, and for them to just come up with all these ideas, put them on the paper, and there's no wrong answers. We really want to encourage students to not judge too much on what they're putting down on the paper. It's just an idea dump. You can always go back and cross it out if you want to. It's really not that big a deal. Okay, and the next round that we have is going to be the resources round. Okay, and in this round, it's the same thing. The first thing we do is that from what they have with the community page, they will choose a particular option that they've already lined out. For example, let's say Surabaya City. And so when they do the resources, they think about the types of resources that are required by that particular community. Okay, these, I put very simply, very common things that are often considered. We've got food, we've got clean water, like drinking water, housing, and jobs. Those are just examples of some resources. Okay, and at the moment, they're not focusing on a particular problem yet. This is, again, just an idea dump first. Okay, and in the third round is going to be a little longer than the other rounds. The other rounds would be 2 to 3 minutes. This last round, which is the cascading effects round, they will choose one of the resources that they named in the resources round. They're going to focus on that, and then they're going to look at what would happen if this resource were to suddenly become super abundant. Okay, and of course, you can change this to become super limited. But in general, we talk a lot about limitations in generally speaking, when we talk about sustainability, but it's also important to consider what happens when we have a superabundance of something, okay? And an example that I chose, so I chose food as one of the resources to focus on, okay? And so, for example, if we had a huge accessibility of food within the community, that could lead to very good outcomes, right? If you think about it, food could help feed a lot more people in the city. It could result in hopefully a more even distribution of food so that more people are not going to bed hungry. And so we encourage students not just to think about the bad, not just to think about the good, and start to think about these things in more complex manners. And so let's say we do feed the population and more people are having access to food. Once you start to see the effects, you'll see that if there is more food, there's also going to be more food waste, right? Just naturally, again, like I said, food waste is a natural part of what happens when we eat. No one finishes, it's not everyone is able to finish everything on their plate, right? So if you're going to have more food, you're going to have more waste generated. Okay, this waste needs to go somewhere. We need to then consider that if it has nowhere to go, what happens? And that's what happened in Surabaya, where the waste started to pile up on the streets. You've got things like disease and rats and these consequences of an abundant resource that result. And we try to challenge the students to look at different pathways. So here, let me just write this down really quickly. Feed the population. Okay, and here's just an example. It's not, I hope you guys can read my writing, but if you got the food, you've got a better way to feed the population. You got excess waste, right? And then excess waste can lead to health problems. There's going to be people who are going to have to clean up. And then you can just go down, it can branch off, whatever, right? Yep, I think you can see there. Okay, and we try not to have students stick to just one route. We encourage them to just go another route too. What if that food was in excess? What's another consequence that could happen? Let's say Okay, so let's say there's increased food consumption, right? It could lead increased food consumption. It could lead to things like increased rates of obesity. It could lead to increased health costs. It can lead to all these different effects that would not necessarily might not originally be considered as part of the original problem. Okay, and like I said, this is just an example. We tend to spend about 7 to 10 minutes on this one round because we encourage students not even to just think linearly. They can think, some of them have like gone in circles, some of them have gone like all the way off the page. Like that, we really want the students to just think about these really big problems because they are really complicated. Okay, and then once they have that, okay, that's when we can focus on one of those chains of events that they talk about and what's affecting their community. And that's when we will that's when we can actually start to think of solutions, because we've already laid out the problem in all these different steps so that the solution will end up being multi-tiered. For example, okay, if we have the issue of increased obesity because of the increase in food, we've got the increased health costs, then a solution that students can start to think about is creating these programs to help people exercise, for example, right? They can start to address the problem of like the food in general as a way to combat the obesity problems. Like that's a resource that they can start to, I'm getting a little frazzled. Basically the idea is that they have all these different points to look at the problem, and then we can start to have students think of these innovative solutions coming from almost anywhere in these different rounds. And it's just to get their brains thinking, and it's just to get them talking to each other, because that's when some of the best ideas come from people. Okay, and after that brainstorming activity, we actually keep all the papers that the students do. We use them. The second part of this webinar is going to be lesson 11. So yeah, lesson 11. And so we do come back to this issue and we do look at the Surabaya example again so that they can go through some of our other lessons and start to pull in more ideas from that. Okay, and so this is the next activity that we do with the students. We have them move from the Surabaya example and actually look at tackling a particular problem and a particular issue, and using the same brainstorming tools so that the students can start to think about how it's actually applicable to the things that they may or may not want to do. We introduce this idea of like a plot of land in their neighborhood, like a storefront, where the community that is tired of all these chain restaurants are asking for a different approach for a restaurant concept. And we ask the students to identify that community that they want to target, because it might not be the physical community around them. They might think of smaller communities within that. They might, the second part will be to consider the resources and the problems associated with those resources, whether in abundance or in scarcity, that are associated with having this kind of restaurant. And finally, we have the students go a step further than the original brainstorm, but actually to start thinking about the solutions. Okay, and to stress, this entire lesson is just a brainstorming lesson, and it's important to tell those students that, because sometimes they will want to give you like a perfect answer. It's fine, but the idea is to just get them to start thinking. Okay, and we take students through that first brainstorming part, which is linked to the walkthrough activity that we did. And next, we also take them through concept design. We take them through figuring out how to get this concept now that they've decided on it, and how are they going to portray it to their customers, to their target community, and how are they going to translate their ideas into physical designs and to the actual message that they're trying to get across. Okay, and what we do in lesson 9 and lesson 11 is we'll start to actually design the menu that ties into using the mealworms that we have, and they'll actually learn how to cook with them. And then we also have in lesson 11 is where they're designing the storefront, and they're going to be giving the ideas for them to give presentations and to draw in all the lessons that they learned throughout this course and use that in order to convince us, like the members of the neighborhood, being role played by the people in the classroom, as a way to say, like, this is our concept and these are the ways that we think will help solve this particular problem in our community, and this is the way that we plan to get there. Okay. Yeah, and this is actually it's a pretty exciting lesson for students to know that they're going to be drawing in information from different lessons that we introduce to them. It is very much a discussion-heavy lesson. We do encourage the students to speak up a lot, so it is a little difficult for me to do this here, but in general, we do want to make sure that it's a safe space for the students to throw down ideas, because ultimately we need to facilitate this this atmosphere of sharing, so that in general we can start to get ideas that will help us as a society move forward. Okay, so that's basically what I have for you guys today. This is a bit of a shorter lesson. Yeah, if you have any questions, please type them in. I know I moved kind of fast, so please let me know. I'll talk a little bit more about the next lesson that we have coming up. Okay, so our next webinar is going to be output for microalgae, and this is going to be us creating this photobioreactor. I'm going to do it from home, actually, since I'm working from home right now. But we're going to be using things like the recycled plastic bottles. We're going to be, the students are going to be collecting microalgae just out their window. They can do this at school, they can do this at home. And we're going to be using the frass from the Hive Explorer, the mealworm poop, in order to facilitate the growth of these microalgae. And we'll be talking about some of the links between the Hive Explorer and the microalgae, and also how microalgae relate to the field of sustainability. Okay, so I hope you guys enjoyed that very fast-paced lesson today. You're actually more than welcome to try out the brainstorming yourself if you would like to. It's just a very, very simple tool that we've used as trying to get students to start to think about these problems in more complex ways, but also breaking down the problems. And honestly, if you start to look at the communities around you and where you're from, you'll realize that sustainability in general, there's no one solution, which is why activities like this of brainstorming and understanding the local community are really important. And since we have people from all over the place joining us today, it would be pretty cool to see if you can identify, just look throughout your own neighborhood, even you don't have to look that far, and think about these sustainability issues that are affecting people, whether or not they're labeled as sustainability issues. Think about the resources that your community uses. Think about the ways in which the resources are used, whether this is an efficient way, maybe it's an inefficient way, and start to plan out the brainstorm. If you're interested, you can definitely let us know. We can give you the outline for this brainstorming activity, and you can give it a try yourself, okay? And if you do, even if you think that there are ways that we can improve on this, then just also let us know too. Okay, I'm just gonna look at the comments before we go. Yeah, we have Jose who wrote a quick message. He said he helped to develop a web page. So you actually have experience coming up with, or like figuring out a problem and trying to figure out a solution. So we'd really love to hear from you. If other people have stories, please share them. We want to encourage a discussion. This is kind of hard on the webinar, but format. And anyway, I just wanted to remind everyone that we have that 20% discount code if you do want to take a look at the Hive Explorer at the course curriculum that we have. And please, these are just this is just a discount code that you can only get through the webinar. So it's a big deal that you guys are joining us today. We wanted to reward you for that. And please, 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 if you have time, take a look at our website and also use the QR code and take a look at our feedback page so you can help us develop these webinars a little better. We would appreciate positive, negative, whatever. It's all constructive. I appreciate that. And yeah, I hope you guys have a great time. Yeah, have a great week. Thank you again for joining us, and I hope to see you all next time. I'll leave the PowerPoint on for a few more minutes, but for now, I'll see you next time. Our next webinar is going to be the next Tuesday. That's Tuesday for me, so 1 week from whenever you're watching this. And there will be a blog post that I will post in the next day or two, which will be about human-insect relationships, and will hopefully give you just another way to think about the way that we think about sustainability and yeah, our partnerships with our insect allies. Okay, thank you again. Bye.